Welcome back to Intro to World Music, where we finish our discussion today on music of the Arab world with some additional selections that you'll find in your text. One of them, track 421, called Abenamar from North Africa. This is part of what is known as the Sephardic Jewish tradition. And the Sephardic tradition implies that these were Jews who were expelled from Spain during the Spanish Inquisition, okay, of the 16th century, 15th century, the Spanish Inquisition. One of the things that they did was to expel all the Jews and Muslims from Spain. Basically, anybody that was not Catholic was basically sent somewhere else. And so many of these people had to relocate to different places, including North Africa, which is where a large number of the Jews from this tradition ended up. So their music has been preserved only because, in many ways, some of those folks immigrated to other places, including the United States. So the recording that you have on your CD is exactly that kind of thing. It's done in a studio in the U.S., but it represents a 13th century song that has been recreated by modern performers. Let's listen to this performance. You're going to hear a special drum called the doumbek, and you can find on your text on pages 504 and 505. You can find the translation and also some of the transliteration of the music on those pages. Here is Abenamar.
Abenamar, Abenamar, moro de la morería, el día en que tú naciste, grandes señales había. Estaba la mar en calma, la luna estaba crecida, moro que en tal sitio nace, no debe decir mentira. Yo nos la diré, Señor, aunque me costó la vida, que de chico y de muchacho mi padre me lo decía, que mentiras no dijese, que era grande mi alegría.
As they progress through, then, they keep adding more and more instruments. You hear the drone of the string instrument, then you hear some additional sounds. You hear a flute come in, eventually you hear the doumbek coming in, and eventually all of the ensemble is there, and it becomes more of a dance-like song towards the end of your excerpt. The next track that you have on your CD is from Egypt, Sirat Bani Hilal. And this represents the singing of epic poetry. If you read in your text, you'll find that these come from the Bedouin people, which are nomadic tribes that exist in the deserts, particularly in Egypt. And so in this particular music, you hear the singer chanting this epic poetry. Okay? And if you turn in your text to this section from CD 424, you'll find a long description of how this is done. you're hearing a fiddle, two-string fiddle called a rabab being played here. Does that ring a bell from any other cultures we've studied? Indonesia, there was a fiddle called the rubab, wasn't there? A slightly different spelling, but probably there is a connection to be made here. You can also look at the erhu in China, which, what does erhu mean? Two strings, and hu means barbarian, meaning that it came from somewhere else. And the somewhere else is probably the Middle East, the Arab world, where that instrument originally came along the Silk Road. So in this case, the rabab fiddle is accompanying the epic poetry, which is one of the most important aspects, which is one of the most important pieces of literature in the Arab world, the Sirat Bani Hilal. And so the performer in this case is reciting this poetry over the accompaniment of the rabab fiddle. Now, the ethnomusicologist Dwight Reynolds has done a great deal of study on this and has come up with a theory of what he calls formulaic composition, in which these small melodic formulas get repeated and used in different types of maqams, different scales, different formats, and they get passed back and forth from song to song so that they are relying on these little formulas that they then plug into this song and that song, and that's his theory on how this particular tradition has continued over the years. Here's a bit of Sirat Bani Hilal excerpt.
نفسه من عدم ذكرة الصبيان فقعد رزقي ينشد على عدم ذكرة الصبي كلام تسمع إليه وعاشق جمال النبي كتر من الصلاة عليه. ليه يا أخوان؟ الحمد لله.
So the spoken text that you just heard, if you turn to page 519, you see that this is a pre-performance commentary by the performer conveying blessings upon the Prophet Muhammad and honoring the fathers of the main characters. And then the rabab begins, and then the poetry begins to be recited and sung over the top of the rabab accompaniment.
نفسه من عدم ذكرة الصبيان فقعد رزقي ينشد على عدم ذكرة الصبي كلام تسمع إليه وعاشق جمال النبي كتر من الصلاة عليه. ليه يا أخوان؟ الحمد لله.
And the excerpt you have in your text is just a small excerpt from a performance that would go on for a very long time, perhaps all night. The last excerpt you have that is on this page of the PowerPoint is an oud takasim. What is a takasim? You remember from your reading? Yes, Casey? An improvisation, that's exactly right. The takasim, when we first heard the takt ensemble at the very beginning, our very first excerpt, there was a section where each instrument would play an improvisation, and that's called a takasim. So the excerpt you have in your text is an oud takasim, and it's in a maqam called rast. That's the particular scale that's being used here. And the point of having it in here is for the author to continue to show how the theory of formulaic composition is used in order to construct these improvisations. So the players have these little melodic formulas in their minds that they've played for years and years, and then they use those. They grab from this and that like a smorgasbord of improvisatory formulas that they string together in different ways each time they perform it. So no two performances will be exactly the same, but they are relying on these little formulas that they have used for a long time in order to string it together. Here's a bit of the Oud Takasim in Makam Rast. And that continues for quite some time. The last track that you have on your CD is an example of a world beat composition. And your text always tries to have some example of how the traditional and the popular have been blended in some way. And so the example that you have on your CD at the very end, CD 4, track 27, Imnin Alu, is an example of the Yemen Jewish tradition. And this has an interesting history. If you read your text section on this part, you will find that there were a large number of Jews living in Yemen who, at the beginning of the establishment of the State of Israel in 1948, were airlifted from Yemen to Israel to help to create the State of Israel. And this music is from that particular tradition, but it's a very popular performer named Ofra Haza who has gained quite a bit of popularity in this style. The text, "Heaven is attentive even when the world is not." So the world beat example, Imnin Alu. There's a lot of cross-cultural fertilization there between the music of India and the music of the Arab world. Certainly the sound of the ornamentation on the voice, you know, and the whole idea of a note not being something that just gets held up for a long time, but something that moves around quite a bit. Yeah, you hear a lot of that happening. That's a good question, though. But it kind of leads me into my last topic here on this unit, which is the whole idea of the Arab world diaspora, the fact that Arab music exists all over the world, wherever it has had a chance to go. And one of those places that is of particular interest, I think, is the Xinjiang Autonomous Region in China. Xinjiang Autonomous Region. It's not called a province. In China, there are lots of provinces. Like, for example, Shandong is a province. Guangdong is a province of China. But there are certain areas of China that are called autonomous regions because they have large minority populations that they want to try to recognize as, in some ways, self-governing entities. To illustrate this, I have a map of China that I'm going to put up here for you. And what you'll see is that the two largest regions of China here in the west are, in the north, Xinjiang, and in the south, Tibet. And both of them have political issues with the government of China, in the fact that the large minority populations that live in these regions in many ways feel that they should have their own separate nation and not be part of the People's Republic of China. The Chinese government tends to disagree with that, and this causes lots of political strife and, in some cases, civil unrest. And you may have read about civil unrest and sometimes rioting occurring in places like Tibet and places like Xinjiang province, where the largest city is called Urumqi or Urumqi, depending on which way you pronounce it. Urumqi is the Chinese way. Urumqi is the Uyghur way of pronouncing it. So what is a Uyghur? The Uyghurs are the largest minority population in Xinjiang province. There are about 9 million of them. And they don't look particularly Chinese. And they don't speak Chinese. They don't speak Mandarin Chinese. They speak a language which is more similar to Turkic or Arabic than it is to Chinese. And certainly the people look a lot different than the Han Chinese as well. In China, there are 56 minority groups. The largest population is the Han race, of which 90% of the population, it consists of 90% of the population. So that 10% of the population is the 56 minority groups that exist in China, and the Uyghurs are one of the biggest ones. Now, there's a lot of political controversy because the Uyghurs really feel like they should have their own separate nation, and they feel it should be a separate nation because they were there first, before the Han Chinese came in and took over. But then the Han Chinese point out that they settled that area 3,000 years ago. So there's all sorts of controversy that goes on in terms of who got there first and who settled it first. It's a desert region. It's very dry. And for that reason, that some unusual kinds of things occur. When people die, sometimes their bodies get preserved for long periods of time. And anthropology-wise, a startling example of this occurred when some mummies were discovered, which had been preserved for thousands of years. And you can go to the museum in Urumqi, the Xinjiang Autonomous Region Museum, and you can see these mummies there in glass cases, hermetically sealed. And they are incredible to see. I brought some pictures of them to show you today. They're pretty amazing because they've been dated back, carbon dated back 4,000 years, the oldest one. So let me show you these pictures of these mummies. This is probably the most famous one is the Corpse of the Lulan Beauty. But this is probably the oldest one. She's projected to be about 4,000 years old. Here's an infant mummy. Here are a couple of male mummies, here and here, both of which are about 3,000 years old. And they were incredibly well preserved because of the dry climate, and so and as well as their clothing. Okay, so what is the significance of the age of these people? Well, if you look at these people, and they've done DNA tests as well, they are the DNA and just the visual information we have about them makes them clearly of Caucasian European descent, which means that there were Caucasian people settling this area 4,000 years ago. The earliest East Asian people, or Han race, came 3,000 years ago, and the Uyghurs came in about 840 AD. Okay, now, why is this significant? Because everybody wants to say we were there first, but the evidence suggests that it was actually the Europeans that were there first, and they don't have any claim to the region at all. So this sort of controversy, this fight between the Chinese and the Uyghur people continues on, and they use things like this as evidence for one side or another that we are there first, or we should be in charge, or we shouldn't be in charge. All of that is very murky and very political. But we're here actually to study music, and so what I want to show you is what the music of the Uyghur people is like, and how that relates to the Arabic music that we're studying in this unit. One of the things that is really interesting to look at is this instrument, which is called a dap, D-A-P. It's a Uyghur tambourine. I bought it when I was in Xinjiang province in 2008. I was there because my wife and I adopted a child from China at that time, a second of two children, and this young man came from Urumqi, which is the biggest city in Xinjiang province. And so I bought this dap at the International Bazaar in Urumqi, which is a really famous bazaar with lots of interesting things to buy, a lot of it Uyghur made. And the Uyghur tambourines are set up very much like the Arabic daf or rik that we studied earlier, and the spelling similarity is quite striking too. D-A-P, dap, for the Uyghur instrument, D-A-F-F, daf or rik for the Arab world instrument. It also has the dum and tak sounds, dum, tak, just like we heard with the rik. But the most interesting thing to me are the jingles, which are made up of keychains. And I'll pass this around so you can see it. But this is a standard Uyghur practice to make all sorts of decorative items as well as their daps instruments out of keychains. They probably have they're probably the largest consumers of keychains on the planet when you think about it. So I'll pass this around so that you can see how that's constructed. And my friend Dan has also lent me something that a Uyghur friend of his gave him, which is a decorative item showing a wide variety of Uyghur instruments. And you're going to hear some of these in a little bit. Most of them are string instruments or plucked instruments, but there's also an example of a dap in here as well. And then the whole thing is basically set up on a dap with the same keychains around the outside. So it's a sort of a standard procedure. But you can get a chance to see a variety of the instruments that way. These instruments are very similar to the instruments of the Arab world we have studied. And if you look at the map in your text again, at the very beginning of your chapter, you'll see the ancient Silk Road, which passed through the Middle East and all the way to China for the purposes of trading silk and other various and sundry items. That map is on page 474. And as you can see by looking at this map, the Silk Road starts here in Arabia, as it's labeled here, goes up all the way through a town called Turfan. Turfan is located in Xinjiang Autonomous Region, just like Ulaanbaatar. And so it came right through that town. So it's no wonder that there is a lot of Arab music in Xinjiang province. And the Uyghur population, some have postulated that they actually came from Mongolia when the Mongolian Uyghur Empire dissolved in about 840 AD. But the Silk Road was clearly a major influence here in bringing these instruments into China through trade and various other purposes. So what is the Uyghur music like? Well, there are 12 songs that are quite famous in the Uyghur music tradition, and they are called muqam, M-U-Q-A-M. Does that sound familiar to another term we've run into? Yeah, what term did we run into before? What have we used? What was the scale called? A maqam, M-A-Q-A-M. The scale was called a maqam. Here the Uyghurs have these 12 famous muqam. And if you go to YouTube and you Google Uyghur muqam, you'll find all sorts of examples of performances that are pretty clearly managed traditionalism. They're fairly well staged, lots of colorful costumes. Everybody is in their place, and it looks very organized. So if you go to YouTube and look at Uyghur muqam, you'll see a lot of performances that are very typical of the kind of thing you will see on Chinese television, particularly during festivals and holidays, when there's a lot of programs like this on television showing minority groups performing and appearing to have a good time. But as I've mentioned before in this course, managed traditionalism happens for a lot of different reasons. Sometimes political reasons, sometimes monetary reasons. And if you compare this to a CD of field recordings of Uyghur muqam, you hear quite a difference. Let me read to you from the notes on a recording of Uyghur muqam that I was able to acquire recently. It says, performers each play and sing their own tune while collaboratively working under a united form and spirit. It's sort of a, what kind of texture is that? Heterophonic texture is what they're describing there. Performers follow an improvised tradition. A lot of improvisation going on, like the Takasim, for example, that we've been listening to. Singers make full use of their voice as if screaming their heads off. It says that here. I'm not making that up. This is their way to express their feelings in their natural environment. As a result, the Dolan muqam, Dolan is the name for wandering tribes of Uyghur people in Xinjiang province. The Dolan muqam are often referred to as the songs that are cried out in deserts. And then the dance of the Dolan muqam is a manifestation of the Dolan's hunting activities. So did it sound like these folks were screaming their heads off in the recording that you heard on YouTube? No. Highly managed situation there on YouTube. Now listen to what the real thing sounds like. Yeah, I've set you up for this. It better be good, right? Yeah, it's not easy listening. I mean, oh yeah, well, wait till it got better. Wait till you hear when you go on to number 3 and number 4, these guys are just like, they've got the microphone up next to this guy that is just literally like screaming his head off. It sounds like he's been screaming all night, which these things tend to go on for a long period of time. So. So completely unrefined sound there, and when you compare that to the things that you see on YouTube, you can tell that the YouTube versions have been cleaned up and regulated pretty severely, so that perhaps Westerners will be more attracted to the sound. But when you hear that unrefined sound of these recordings, you understand the difference between traditional and the managed quality of the other. I mean, some of these tracks, the guys are just screaming, and it's just kind of painful to hear for a Westerner to hear this. But that's their culture. That's how they express. And vocalists are probably just cringing, thinking, "Oh, these people are hurting their vocal cords." But that's how they express themselves. That's how they express themselves in their culture. In this final episode, I want to touch on a theme that has happened many times throughout the course of this semester, that of managed traditionalism. And I would like to tie things together by referring to music of several of the cultures that we have studied and how it relates to the fact that traditional music has been managed in some way. We'll look at a couple of different ways in which that is done. One is through commercialism, and the other is through government control. The commercialism category is in several parts, and it's discussed first in chapter 10 of your text, and you may remember having read that early on, that commercial music is definitely something that has an effect on traditional music. Music changes when money is involved. There's no question about that. back in the 18th century, it was a great honor for music to be borrowed by a composer to pay homage to another composer. J.S. Bach, for example, took trio sonatas of Antonio Vivaldi and used them to create organ pieces that he later called his own. So it was, but everybody knew they were by Vivaldi, and it wasn't like Vivaldi was losing any money by Bach using his music. So it was considered a great honor for a composer to borrow your music and write something of his own using your music as a jumping off place. That all changed when money became involved, and in 1909, when the copyright law started to involve sound recording, all of a sudden it became a big issue to steal somebody else's music or to borrow somebody else's music, and there have been many, many court cases ever since that time that have defined what copyright law is today. Now, another way that music, we see music being affected by commercialism is looking at the Branson phenomenon. Branson started back in the 1950s with Ozarks traditional music, and there were a couple of shows, and then eventually it morphed into more of a country music kind of thing, and so more and more performers started coming there. And then it became what it is today, an entertainment mecca that does more than just country music, and it involves many, many stars of the past who find ways to create theaters and create their followings that come to see them. We see this same kind of thing happen where music from the British Isles, for example, is transformed in the Ozarks for some reason or another. It's similar to the way we saw the song Weevely Wheat, the Ozark folk tune, which came from the British Isles, but and spoke about Bonnie Prince Charlie, for example, early on. And the reference to Bonnie Prince Charlie is still there in the lyrics "Bake a Cake for Charlie," but we don't have that same meaning anymore because we're talking about bugs getting into our flour. I don't want none of your Weevely wheat. So in this case, the Ozarks have changed that style. In the same way, the Branson phenomenon has put a commercial twist on the music that originally started as Ozark folk music. In this way, it has been packaged for consumers. The vocal slides, for example, that we originally heard on the song Barbara Allen become used by country music artists to display emotion and to try to create an emotional effect in their song. If you listen again to Barbara Allen, I'll show you what I mean. Listen to the vocal slides that take place in this song, Barbara Allen.
All in the merry month of May, when the green buds they were swelling, young William Green on his deathbed lay, for the love of Barbary Ellen. He sent his servant to the town, to the place where she was dwelling, saying, Master's sick and he sends for you, if your name be Barbary Ellen. So slowly, slowly she got up, and slowly she came anigh him, and all she said when she got there, young man, I believe you're dying.
Now, when the country music style takes the vocal slides and uses it to create emotion within their songs, we get the same kind of effect that you hear on the following song performed by Patsy Cline in the 1950s. Please listen to Patsy Cline.
I stopped to see a weeping willow crying on his pillow. Maybe he's crying for me. And as the skies turn gloomy, night winds whisper to me, I'm lonesome as I can be.
Another example of commercial music affecting traditional music is how we have seen artists throughout this course be able to take their music and create a market for it someplace else, particularly in America. We saw Mincer Hatic, for example, from Bosnia, the accordion player who now lives in St. Louis. We heard his recording, Last Stop Birchko. We also saw Sergei Shapoval in the Eastern European segment when you saw the Ukrainian performer performing for young children and realized that he sends all the money that he makes back to his family in the Ukraine because he can't make money in that culture. We saw Paco Padilla from Mexico come up and perform the Nueva Canción song that you have in the Latin American chapter. In this case, he has taken what was originally a political style and turned it into more of a commercial style in order to sell CDs. We saw Luis Lema and Antonio Aguilar from Bolivia performing at the Ozark Empire Fair. They're based out of Chicago. So in all of these cases, we see the original culture not being able to support the art. Another example of this commercialism affecting the art can be found in music for the Hulus. There's a song called There Is a Beautiful Place that I'd like to play just a small snippet of and listen to the original melody on the Hulus. Now, when you go to China and you buy CDs of Hulus music, and the song that you're going to hear came from actually the method book on how to play the Hulus, and there's a CD that comes with it. And the player plays this song, but back behind it there is a synthesized accompaniment along with bass and drums in a very Western sense. Apparently, they don't feel that they can sell the CD to Westerners unless there is a Western beat going behind it and Western style accompaniment. So in this way, they have tried to tailor the folk music towards the audience where they think they can sell it. Thus, they have managed the traditionalism for commercial reasons. As I stated before, I think that America can be very proud of being able to help support music from these other cultures. In many ways, the music is dying off in these cultures for one reason or another, whether it's financial reasons or technological reasons, and America is able to support those, particularly through its universities, and I think that's something of which Americans should be very proud. I should also say that music that is affected by commercialism in this way is not necessarily a negative thing. It's simply a changed thing. So it's important for the listener to be aware that even if you like the music better, having the accompaniment and the drums behind the hulusa, the fact is that it is not in its original form. It has been changed from its traditional format. We see that kind of thing happen a lot through government control as well. And that is the next large category that I want to talk about in this episode, in which the government has controlled the music in some way. The Chinese instrument that you saw Meng Lei play earlier in the course, called the dizi. You also saw a couple other students playing that instrument. That instrument is originally played by people who were not very high in the social chain in China. Prior to 1949, the dizi and the people who played the dizi were not very well respected within the culture. They were sort of at the bottom of the social food chain for musicians. In 1949, when Mao and the communists took power, one of the things they did was to decide to promote the dizi as an instrument of great culture and to raise it to a higher level. Their literature prior to 1949 was not written down. It was strictly an oral tradition. Now you will find a tremendous amount of dizi literature, but the fact is that it is music that has been written in a folk style, composed by composers after 1949. This phenomenon has been researched very carefully by a scholar named Frederick Lau, who teaches at the University of Hawaii. Professor Lau did his doctoral dissertation on the music of the dizi, and he puts forth the premise that most of the literature that we hear on this instrument is actually written in a folk style by composers since 1949. So in this case, the music is not going to be the original dizi music, but it is based on that. So in this way, you can see that the government and government control has had an effect on traditional music. In Chinese, this music is called Minsu Yinyue, or abbreviated Minyue, and it is translated as national or people's music. Something that the communists are very interested in promoting is music of the people, thus raising the status of the dizi and the dizi player to a higher level. Another scholar on Chinese music, Patricia Sheehan Campbell, has written that there is a difference between the word authentic and the word traditional. Authentic versus traditional. There is a difference between those two. By her definition, the new dizi literature is traditional, but it is not necessarily authentic. So you see there the difference between those two terms and how they are used by Campbell. Now, the music is no less valid because it is not authentic, because it has been managed in some way. And what I'd like you to do is to listen to a performance by my colleague Meng Lei from Qingdao University, who is the dizi professor there, playing a composition entitled Trip to Gusu. Once again, we see musicians working within their system to produce art. In Professor Meng's case, he has the need to produce art within the system that he has available to him, which happens to be the communist system where the dizi has been changed to a different status. Please enjoy his performance of Trip to Gusu. Other examples that we have seen in this course of government-managed traditionalism include the composition in the Bosnian chapter, O Sharjia, involving the Sharjia lute, in which case the music had been brought into the studio and cleaned up. You may recall that particular track. We also saw this in a composition that I played in class by the Bulgarian Women's Chorus Radio Choir, Pilinca Pei. This is on the album entitled Mystery of Bulgarian Voices, and this was recorded prior to the fall of communism in Bulgaria. Let's listen to this song again and see if you detect the managed traditionalism that is going on here. So where does all this leave us as we finish this course? Well, first of all, you're left with a lot of material. There has been so much material in this course that you're probably very happy that we're not having a final exam. Instead, I'm expecting you to really get into your final project in terms of finding a very personal involvement with some aspect of traditional music in some way. I want you to find a music culture and make it work for you. I'm not interested in a report on the life of Frank Sinatra. I can get that by going to the internet. Instead, I want you to find a music culture that you're going to report on and then interview somebody. Or if you're doing the performance version of this, looking for you to perform on some kind of a world music instrument. Either way, I want you to be actively involved rather than simply regurgitating some facts off the internet. I want you to allow this course to become more than just a hoop for you to jump through so you can get your degree. My hope is that some aspect of this will inspire you to investigate further the particular music culture that you have started to learn about, whether it's something that you did for your final project or something else that you learned in the course. My hope is that you will take that with you and ultimately learn more about it. The goal of college is for you to be a lifelong learner and not for you to simply get the grade in the course so that you can move on. So applying this information later in your life is something that I truly hope that you will end up doing. Be an active rather than passive person in where music is concerned. Instead of just owning an iPod and listening to music, try to find a way to participate in music in some way, whether it's simply playing the cymbals at a festival or some other more active kind of way. Find a way to be actively involved in music. Finally, please use this opportunity to develop an appreciation for other cultures so that when you come in contact with people from these cultures, you will have some frame of reference for being able to work with them in a more personal way than if you didn't know anything about their culture. I've spoken about this before, but it's one of the overriding themes of this course that I hope that you will take this with you in terms of being involved in another culture. I wish you the very best in all of your future endeavors. Good luck on your final projects, and goodbye. 再见.